Thank you all for coming. Lema Gbowee was a 17-year-old girl in 1989 when the war first came to Monrovia, Liberia. And as she says, she turned from a child into an adult in a matter of hours. As the war dragged on, the first round of civil war in Liberia, Lema had difficulty focusing on anything but her frustration over her thwarted opportunities to go to college. And out of bitterness, she really, for a time, dodged any kind of political or social involvement early on. But as time wore on and as the war wore on and the impact of it, she really came to see that it would be up to the citizens of Liberia, and especially to women, to bring the country back from the insanity of the Civil War. She trained as a trauma counselor and worked with ex-child soldiers of Taylor's army. And the more she worked with them, the more she came to see that they too were victims of this war, this insanity. So Lema joined the Women in Peacebuilding Network at the time, and she quickly rose to the leadership thanks to her own leadership and organizing skills, which were and are extraordinary. She brought all the women of the Christian churches together into a group and called the Christian Women's Initiative, and then began issuing a series of calls for peace with that group. But then soon she formed a broader coalition with the women of the Muslim organizations in Monrovia, and eventually the Liberian Mass Action for Peace came into being. And under Lema's leadership, the group managed to accomplish some rather extraordinary things. They, as women, decided to remove their jewelry and their makeup and dress in very simple white clothing and white headscarves. They would stand silently on the side of the road and on the main road where Charles Taylor and his entourage would travel every day, and stand in sort of silent protest. And slowly their numbers grew to 1,000 or more. And eventually they were able to, I guess I would say, encourage Charles Taylor to meet with them. And they were able to extract a promise from him to eventually agree to peace talks with the rebels in Ghana. So the delegation of Charles Taylor's group and the rebels went and met in Ghana to negotiate, and so Lema led a delegation of the Liberian women there to see how it was going. And what they found after a time is that, as legend has it, there was little actual negotiation going on. There was little progress being made in the negotiation, and part of it was that the realities of war had been such that it was extraordinarily devastating to the men who were involved directly, and now they were in a hotel with food and warmth, and it was kind of nice to be there, and so there wasn't an incredible incentive to make a lot of progress. But at some point the women became particularly frustrated with this, particularly as the war continued to ravage Liberia and move into Monrovia, where many of their families were. And so they one day agreed to construct a human barricade around the hotel. So they joined hands and encircled the building and wouldn't allow the men, the negotiators, to leave until they made genuine progress toward a peace agreement. So at one critical point, the police came to arrest Lema for this civil disobedience. And in a somewhat desperate fit of fury and desperation and indignation, Lema cried, and I'm paraphrasing this, something like, "If you're going to arrest me, let me make it easy for you. Here, I'll take my clothes off and give them to you." So she started to disrobe immediately in public. And in this part of Africa, that is a very taboo, very shaming thing, so the police fled. And eventually turned and began to support the women, and they would tell them of the men that were trying to sneak out windows, so the women would circle around, and they really began to support the work of the women. In time, the tactics worked, and the men agreed to work more diligently on a peace agreement, which they did achieve. But then, even then, after the peace was brokered, The Liberian women went back to Liberia and went back to the villages and worked carefully to explain the agreement, to explain the implications of the agreement, and to really help foster the implementation of it, with the idea that if this would fail here, that they would need to organize again and continue to put pressure where pressure was necessary. Lema has been honored by way too many organizations to mention them now, but let me just cite a few. She has been awarded the Blue Ribbon for Peace by Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award on behalf of her countrywomen. She won the 2009 Gruber Women's Rights Prize, which honors an individual who has brought about significant advances in the quest for peace and gender equality in Africa. In 2009, the Celebrate Africa 2009 committee honored Ms. Gbowee and her network during the annual celebration of in Philadelphia at the African American Museum, and she was named a living legend in March 2009 by Emmanuel Brinklow Seventh-day Adventist Church. In April 2010, she was awarded the John J. Justice Award, and then, as you know, in 2011, Lema, along with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was the first woman president of an African nation, of Liberia, and Tawakkol Carmen were awarded the 2011 Nobel Peace Prize for, quote, their nonviolent struggle for the safety of women and for women's rights to full participation in peace-building work. Lema is a social worker by profession. She has for many years been a caseworker and a peace-building practitioner. She has founded several organizations and directed the Women, Peace and Security Network in Africa, which was a women-focused, women-run non-governmental organization with the core mandate to promote women's strategic participation and leadership in peace and security in Africa. She's also the founder and president of the now Gbowee Peace Foundation of Africa, the mission of which is critical. It's to promote and facilitate activities and initiatives aimed at promoting peace and reconciliation through the holistic participation of local communities. One of the things she's very active in is educating young African women and negotiating deals, making deals with universities around the world to bring in young African women and educate them so that they can come back to Liberia and come back to Africa and make change. In 2008, the critically acclaimed and award-winning documentary Pray the Devil Back to Hell was made, which won the Tribeca Film Festival Best Documentary. And this film documents the journey of Lema and her group of brave and visionary women who demanded peace for Liberia. If you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend it. It's a fantastic film and a fantastic story. And then later, she published her autobiography, Mighty Be Our Powers, which brings the reader kind of up to date with Lema's now multinational efforts to empower women to bring peace to her country. The book chronicles a more personal response to the adversity, the challenges that she's faced of despair and hope and exhaustion, the hard choice between her family and her work. She's the mother of 6, and the doubts and decision-making of the leader of such a trailblazing civilian protest. One of the most remarkable things about Lema is that her impact seems to grow and grow. She, since the production of the film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, has, with her group, been using the film as a stimulus in conflict zones around the world to speak with and work with women to talk about what might be possible there. So she's worked in Israel-Palestine, she's worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo, she's worked in Sri Lanka, she's been asked to go and work with Syrian women. And we're also very fortunate to have her this year as a visiting scholar at Barnard. She's here, and tonight she's here to share her thoughts and her vision with us. So please join me in welcoming my hero and my friend, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Lema Gbowee.
Thank you, Peter. Please have it. It's been a long day. You don't want to be standing. Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here. Hafiza and I, my colleague, we got lost coming. And I was on the phone with Liberia saying we're lost. And I'll probably get there at the end of the program. But it's truly an honor. Thank you, Peter, and thank you to all of you for going through the day and deciding to stay back and listen to my thoughts. I'm always honored to be here at Columbia, and I'm proud to be a part of this second Sustainable Peace Conference. This is a space to think big and to think about complex ideas and break it down into smaller but effective parts. I want to thank God for His grace and His favor and His mercy that He continues to endow me with, and let me add His strength. Because for the first time in many years, I find myself in New York alone as an African taking care of a 4-year-old. So those Africans in the room who have children and know how many helps we have back home will know that I'm losing my mind. This year, during the International Day of Peace, the UN had a conference, and the title of the conference was Sustainable Peace for Sustainable Future. And the theme was chosen in recognition of the fact that there can be no sustainable future without sustainable peace. And sustainable peace must be built on sustainable development. It is a known fact that there can be no sustainable development without the inclusion and involvement of every stakeholder. For sustainable peace and development to occur or to become a reality, we must endeavor to forge partnership and expand cooperation. I would like to speak with you all today about working together to reach a common goal. This is cooperation, a challenge my 4-year-old is learning, and something that too many of our political leaders have yet to master. Cooperation is a reciprocal relationship among stakeholders, binding them to a shared goal. In wars and conflict, however, we often ask the question, so how does one build cooperation or foster cooperation to build peace? Let's explore, and since I'm coming to Columbia, and this is Columbia, and I am the distinguished fellow in social justice at Barnard, I say sometimes now I have to act like a professor, oh Lord. But it doesn't last very long. The activist in me comes out and the professor goes and sits down. The complexity of cooperation, fostering effective partnership for peace. Since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a surge in global conflict, from Liberia to Sierra Leone, Bosnia to Congo to every part of, especially Africa, has been affected by conflict. And this predicament that we find ourselves in as citizens of the world, recent Syria, Libya, all of these different places, have necessitated many institutions to embark on a journey that I would say a quest for sustainable peace. So everywhere you go, people are talking about we need to find a way to forge sustainable peace. Millions have been spent in the academic world on research towards the same effort. Civil society organizations and grassroots activists have also embarked on this journey. We want, we need, we have to, we must find a way to have sustainable peace globally or even in our little communities. Women and girls who have not or have never been traditionally involved with the quest for peace have also embarked on this journey. The question we need to ask ourselves today, and we need to continue asking ourselves, in the midst of all of these efforts, are we any closer to sustainable peace, whether locally or globally? Are we any closer to when on April 28, 1915, women of the world gathered in The Hague and said, we want to find sustainable peace. We want to put an end to militarism in the world. And that was when the World War I was ongoing. Are we so anywhere closer to sustainable peace? The answer would vary depending on where you find yourself. What is important to note, however, is that sustainable peace can only be attained when individuals and organizations come together to forge a multidisciplinary approach to peace building, cooperation and partnership to create effective good change for the good of the society, coming together with your skill, my skill, bringing it all together and saying this is how we will forge, or this is what we need to forge sustainable peace. Most times as I travel, I get questions like, how did you all do it? How did the Liberian women forge this effective partnership for peace? How did you organize under a single banner to end a civil war? You were from different ethnic groups, different social class, different religious groups, different educational backgrounds, just to list a few. Some of the things that we saw, or what we did, or how you did, the questions keep coming, people keep asking. So how? And most times, depending on where you find yourself, you get people who will specifically ask, so between the Christians and the Muslims, who are the easiest to work with? Sometimes you get, so how did the educated women interact with the native women? But most times, the question about the Christian and Muslims comes from Christians. So was it easy working with the Muslims? And as a Christian woman, I say they are the easiest group to work with. The Christians have too many scriptures to quote about diversity. What fellowship does darkness have with light? What fellowship does the heathen have with the saved? You know, every morning someone will see a vision. The Lord say, you know, so I usually say, let's be honest. Us people, we have problems too. But when we came together, one thing we did, we reflected the same diversities that the perpetrators of war exploited to their violent end. The most popular questions, like I said, how did Christian and Muslim women manage? How did you manage the complexity of cooperation, the clash in cultures and values, the age-old prejudices, stereotypes, victim-perpetrator mindset, diverse political ideologies? How did you balance the tension between complementarity and competition, media spotlight, public support, funding? How? And the how did you is always the overwhelming question for me. And most times I sit and think that these questions come because in the world that we live in, we focus more on the negative and the complex instead of the positive and the doable. Politics today in our different countries is a place where cooperation should be the hallmark for the common good of people. But we see that in our own country, Liberia, for the last 7 years, we've seen a parallel government, the executive at the throat of the legislative at the throat of the judiciary, and we can never have a common agenda for the common good of the people. The recent government shutdown here in the US demonstrates that the lack of cooperation can undermine an entire democratic system and jeopardize the global economic network. In 2012, as Peter said earlier, we started a foundation in Liberia. We focus on education and leadership development for young women. We provide full scholarship for girls. Everything, Hafiza likes to refer to it as 360-degree support. We've gone from Europe to Asia to different places, and we've advocated for scholarship, and they come in the droves. When we started the foundation, I had one worry, that we may never be able to get scholarship. Today, we get scholarship, and the worry is we do not have the qualified students to fill the scholarship. Since we started, we have now over 60 students, but we've gotten only one successful international student on our scholarship. Only one. We've tried. Sometimes we get invitation to send 20 names Sometimes we send it, and they send it back to us. They don't qualify. What is important to note is that these students are Liberia's best. This past summer, Liberia also made headlines when 25,000 students sat the University of Liberia entrance exam and no one passed. In my own region, Bon County, quite recently, 550 students sat the entrance exam for the community college, only 5 persons passed. Imagine in the city of New York, if every student failed the SAT, that would be a catastrophe. But what is happening with our educational system in Liberia is something that we all understand. There's a dire need for overhaul. There's a need for cooperation. And we know that there's no way that we can do this work in a vacuum. We must come together, government, civil society, foundations, whoever is working on education, coming together, putting their resources together and trying to do what is best for the country. However, we have not gotten to that place where we're able to separate politics, and that's the point I'm trying to make. We've never gotten to the place where we're able to separate the politics of today from the greater good of the young generation. We see this in many places. In cases of natural resources, communities can never agree, or government and communities can never agree. Nigeria, Niger Delta is a typical example of the oil curse. How do we spend the resources? Many years ago, they came together and said, let's have a Niger Delta Development Fund. The funds have come. Communities are still crying. We're not getting it. Corrupt officials are taking it. So if you go from Liberia to the US, to Europe, to Asia, to everywhere, governments, communities are in a place where they cannot just understand how to come together, forge effective partnership to even harness development for their people, or to even try to bring just the common good of the people. Politics today is a place where people come not to cooperate, but to be at loggerhead and to see who shout the loudest. Not for the good of the people, but for the good of their party and their common interests. The story of the women of Liberia is something that we continue to put forth. This is a very common story. This is a very simple story, a story of ordinary women who came together and said, despite the diversity, despite all of the stereotypes we have, and sometimes when I think about when we started the movement first, it brings a smile to my face, because I remember there was this one day we decided we were going to do a round table for Christian and Muslim women. We spent the first day working with Christian women, the next day working with Muslim women, and the third day bringing the group together. Women who drove in the same cars walked into the room and went separate ways. And before we knew it, we had one side of the table Muslim, one side of the table Christians. And then we asked people each of the day before when we worked to put down positives and negative stereotypes that they hold of the group. And that morning, as soon as we came together, because we had divided the room, we asked the Muslim women to walk around and read what the Christian women had written about them. And then we asked the Christian women to walk around and read what the Muslim women, in the order of negative first and then going to the positive. So when they started reading, what? Did they say this about us? Oh my God! What? What? And then by the time they were going towards the end of the room, you could hear, oh, that's nice, but that's not true. Because you got things like the Christian women have it all. Their husbands marry only one wife, and they do not have competition with other women. And the Christian women were like, that's not true. We do have competition sometimes. You know, but you had all of these different things, and afterwards we said, okay, let's sit down and talk about some of these things. And people now started talking. And this is where the world has gotten. We've gotten to the place in the world where as long as you're dressed like me, someone look at you and you're a possible immigrant to the US. So they are not looking at what you can bring to the table to create change. Your dress automatically puts a veil between you and that person, or a silent wall between you and that person. If you have a turban, it's even worse. If you have on the hijab, or it's even worse. People focus in our world today on the negatives, the challenges, rather than on the positives. But when we came together in the midst, even in the midst of our complexities and challenges, we still knew one thing was clear for us. We had a purpose. We hated the war and everything it represented. Though we still held on to our individual narratives, that this ethnic group is responsible or that ethnic group was responsible, but we were clear on one thing, that we will work, we will foster effective partnership for the greater good of our people, for the greater good of ourselves. Once we were sitting on the airfield, and we had this woman who was a pastor's wife, and she would say to us, let's ask people their stories, because we don't know why people came. And people started talking and talking and talking. But there was this particular group, every morning they sat by themselves, and this other group would sit by themselves, and were trying to break up these kinds of things and just promote cooperation amongst the women. And there's this one woman who kept saying, when it was her turn to speak, that she didn't want to say anything because it was going to break the group apart. And we said, well, you just need to say what you have to say. And she sat there and said, you see that woman sitting there? Yes. Her son killed my child. And not only did he kill my child, he cut him up and made us buy back every piece in order for us to do a decent burial. And this woman sitting there, she said, so since we came here, and because we came for peace, I've refused to say anything to her. I've refused to do anything with her. I will do my work and go. And some of my friends who are from my ethnic group have decided. So the story was just her son. But no one bothered to ask her what was her story. So people judge her on the basis of a child that she gave birth to. And because of that, they refuse to partner with her, engage with her, or have any interaction with her. And too many times in our world, we see it. I spoke about the dress. But sometimes it's just where you find yourself or your ethnicity, and someone will just... I took a ride, and I've told this story many times before, from Heathrow Airport, somewhere an hour and 30 minutes away from London. And I was really looking forward to sleep because I was exhausted from Accra. I had come from programs and just hopped on the plane to go to London, and I knew I was going to work with 300 young women. I needed all of my energy. If they wanted to dance, I wanted to be at my best. So I told myself I will sleep on this ride and then get there refreshed for whatever I was going to do. Then I looked at my itinerary and saw my driver's name. It was some Islamic name, and I said, thank God. Those Muslim men, they don't talk to strange women. So I'm going to sleep. So when I got there, I saw this very energetic young man say, welcome, madam. Do you want coffee? No. I tried to be as brief and very straight as possible. No. Do you want? No. Usually people come and they need cell phone. Apparently he knew I can't live without my cell phone. I said, yes, do you know where I can get a SIM card? He said, sure, I'll take you. He took me, bought the SIM card, and then I sat in the back. We started the drive. And he said, madam, I said, what? He said, forgive me, but I like to talk too much. I said, oh my God. But in 10 minutes, I had my notepad and my pen out because he had something to say. And one of the things that he said to me that is etched on my memory forever was, he said, today people look at me and I'm a terrorist. No one asks me my name. What they do not know is that for every suicide bomb that goes off, a part of my life is taken away. And he went on to talk about the negative things that he has gone through and things that he had to bear. But this is the situation in our world. So when we finally gave this woman the opportunity to tell her story, it was that child who had also brought friends to rape her. It was that child who was responsible for the death of numerous of her relatives. And after the stories became clear, all of those women in that circle was able to weep with this woman because, yes, I lost a son, but you lost a lot more than I did. In our partnership for effective peace or for sustainable peace in Liberia, we were able to say to ourselves, regardless of your ethnic group creating all of the chaos on us, we will put an end to this for the greater good of our children. We were also clear that there were benefits for this partnership, and that's what politicians miss. That's what communities miss. That's what young people, old people miss when we decide to be at loggerhead and refuse to come together for the common good of our world. That sometimes our complementary interests and objectives are good to come together because the resources globally are scarce. So if we bring it all together, it makes the work effective. We were coming from 16 different ethnic groups. We were coming from different religious groups. We're coming from different social class and different cultural background. And if someone came because we were under one banner and gave us $50, it went a long way in our advocacy campaign. But there was collective learning and implementation that was also happening. I learned a lot about the Muslim culture in 2.5 years than I would ever do in any other time of my life. We also went through the process of avoiding duplication. All of the different skills and talents that people had, we brought together. There was this young woman who walked into the office one day from a church, and the white she had on was almost cream. And we kept looking at each other, and she said, I don't want to be boss. That was her introduction to us. I don't want to sit in this office. I want to be the taxi of the group. I can walk. So when you do not have money to transport letters, give it to me. And before we knew it, beyond the walking, she had a way of gaining access to people who none of us, even with our educational background, could. She would just sneak her way into her room, and next thing she'll be talking to the boss. And everyone will be like, what? Or when we were faced with military men putting barriers between us and UN officials, she would slip between those people as if she was invisible and give our petition to those people. But we needed her skills and her talents. There was this one driver we would use because we never had money. He would park his car. And if I went to him and said we needed to go to this place, he would say, pay me first. And then I would say, but we do not have money. We'll pay you later once we collect some money. But if she went to him, it was like magic. She would stand by, put her arms around him and be saying, get in, he's taking us to wherever we're going. There were women who were there to uphold us in prayers. There were those who were there just to whisper sense when everything seemed to be falling apart. We needed all of those things, and this is something that I think the world has missed when it comes to fostering partnership for peace or for the greater good of society. It's me now. I want to shine. And who is this person to come and shine when my political institution must be the one to shine? So we constantly find ourselves at a place where we are at loggerhead instead of trying to see the good in every other person that we can put together to make this world a truly beautiful place. But one of the things that our partnership did was also to expand our presence. In 2 months after we started, we were in 5 locations. By the time we ended in 2.5 years, we had gone to 15 locations. The head of the UN in Liberia told me, Lima, you all have a network that is like cancer. There is no little village that I drive by, I don't see women in white protesting this war. Partnership, networking, and cooperation are key lessons that I take with me everywhere. Sometimes, even when there is no reason to partner, I'm looking for a reason to partner. But it is key to lasting and sustainable peace. It is key to development. Forging partnership also helps instill some of the values that are needed for sustainable peace to happen in communities. And as I've done this work with the women and continue to go to different places, I realize that some of those things that keeps community going or that kept us going was one, equal participation. Everyone that came was equal in the eyes of. We had a situation once where we had this event, and Charles Taylor had a way of, as politicians, we always do, dividing communities and people. So he had a specific group of women that he called the eminent women of Liberia. We did not fit that category because we're not eminent. And so they acted eminent. They would walk into places like this, and they called him Charles, and he bought them jewelries and gave them cars. And so we had this event, and the women came, but one of the things we did, we never sat in seats. We always sat on the floor. So they came and said, where do we sit? I said, well, everyone is sitting on the floor, and since you all are women, we expect that you will join us. No. There are women, and there are women. By that time, one of the women in our group, who I think her role was to stir up chaos, because everywhere she went, chaos followed. And she's this tall, had jumped up, and somehow I knew her reaction, so I just, oh no, boss, leave me, let me beat these women. I was like, what? In the presence of the president, what do they think or who do they think they are? And there was so much confusion. I said, okay, my eminent mothers, if you don't mind sitting in the back on your chairs, but we cannot allow you to sit in front when the other not so eminent women are sitting on the floor. But the women felt so good that, afterwards, we would always sit and have a conversation and say, Lema, or our ma or mother of peace, if you had just allowed those women to sit in front on chairs, we would have left and never come back. Because then it truly means that you too see them as not our equals. But I carried them so far back that they were sitting next to where we were selling food. And people thought they were selling the food on our behalf. But equal participation is key. In many of our societies where wars have taken place, it's because of marginalization of one ethnic group or one social group that leads to some of the worst civil conflict that we see in the world. When we use equal participation, it fosters nation building. The other thing that, the value that I take away, and I think a lot of those women, was embracing the diversity that we brought around the table and promoting tolerance. There were things that came out that people were upset about, but at the end of the day, You know, the Muslim women always celebrated Ramadan, even as we protested. And one of the times they said their desire was that when it was time to break fast, the Christian women would stay and share their meal. And it became a contentious issue. The Christian women, we are not Muslim, why should we stay and share the meal? So I took it upon myself, knowing that if I went and sat and decided to break fast, even though I didn't fast all day, people would stay. And so, but we had a long conversation about it, and eventually they saw a reason. We had to do certain things to get everyone to understand that we're different, but we are one. We had to use key messages and also had to say to people that you have to be tolerant. Because personally, when I joined the group, even though I was a Christian, I could not fast. And it was those women who helped me along the way. Every time they would check with me when we were fasting and say, how are you holding up? And sometime by 11, I say, I think I feel like fainting. And they will say, get out of here. Because we're on it till 6 p.m. today. But gradually, I mean, really just helping and promoting people, helping people tolerate other people with all of the horrible ways that they came with, even with this one who caused chaos and confusion. People tolerated her, they embraced her, and later on, everyone started seeing the value of her being in the group. I have never seen a woman who can get information when no one can get information like that woman. There will be a murder here. Before the police get there, she already know who killed who. And they will ask her, so how did she say, don't ask me that, just go with, and 90% of the time, she was right. So instead of just having confusion and doing things, and she made friends in some of the most unlikely places. Even though some days, it would take a lot of firm hands. Some of the women would say, tie her close to you because she's about to run loose. But eventually everyone really began to see this person has something valuable to contribute to this group. So everyone was embracing this thing, everyone was embracing that thing. I had one of the most violent tempers that when I got upset, I would pick up chair and say I would break it on anyone's head. And then there was this very old woman in the group who would come to me and say, use my head. And that would just disarm me. Afterwards, the older women would call me and say, do you know what a leader is? A leader is the trash can. You are forced to like everyone as a leader, but not everyone is forced to like you as a leader. It was a school, it was a partnership, but it was a lesson not just for that moment, but it was a lesson for life and for nation building. The other valuable lesson I learned was the recognition of women's unique roles and skills. You know, most times people say, these women, especially for those of us who came from later communities, no one really saw any value in some of these women coming. Why are they here? And I talk about the conversations we have earlier on with some of the women, and one of those women that I would talk to one morning when it was just the two of us sitting on that field at 6 a.m., she was always cold. She was always hungry. And she was always looking for a means of going back home. And one day I asked her, fortunately for me, she spoke my native language, and I asked her in Pele Nepa, what are you doing here? And she asked me back in Pele, Lonika Iye, do you have children? And I said, yes. Shulanga, boys? I said, 2. She said, I had 2. In the first war, 1 was killed. In the second war, the other 1 got killed. When I heard that women were protesting for peace, I came. I don't have any reason for being here, but I came because I don't want you to lose your 2 boys. Even though she looked like a beggar, even though she came very poor and all of her clothes torn up, but she brought something unique to that group. The other valuable lesson that I learned, and I learned this the hard way, was this whole issue of accountability and responsibility. As a leader, you must be accountable and you must be responsible for your action. One of the things the group did very well was, let's decide on this, yes. If it didn't go the right way, Lema is at fault. If it went the right way, oh, we took that decision. You were very nice in allowing us to take the decision. If it went the other way, no, we were not part of that decision. You made it on your own. But this is something that we also have not seen in our world today. Leaders are not accountable to their people. It's worse in Africa. They don't take responsibility for their actions. It's all for self and none for the greater good of the people. The other thing that I learned was that regardless of how small the resources are, when you're partnering, if everyone benefits from those resources or that meager resource, it helps keep the group together. Forging networks and partnership or cooperation is something that is very difficult, but it's something that is doable, and it's something that once you engage and embrace, you never regret. It's been 10 years since we went on to do peace. 10 years since we, as women of Liberia, came out in our numbers. And since 10 years ago, we continue to see different groups of women and different groups of people in different parts of the world coming together and saying, we must do this. I believe, and I'm a firm believer, that if sustainable peace and development must take place, each and every one of us, especially for the global good, must recognize that everyone, regardless of where they come from, regardless of their social class or their educational status, have something to contribute to the greater good of this world. And this can only happen if we unmask or we break down all of those invisible walls that we've created based on the negativity from the media, based on the negativity from every part of the world. It's important for those of us who have never picked up a Quran to pick it up and read. Let me see what is in this book. For those of you who've never picked up a Bible, pick it up. The people say knowledge is power, but these breaking down and tearing down all of the walls that divide us will help us to get to the place where we need to get to. Today, I was having a conversation with the executive director of our foundation, and they've just done staff assessment. And our finance officer wrote something, and she said, I need to share this with you. He's one person who came from a typical traditional background and has never been in a place or was never socialized to take orders from women. And then he came to work for me. And he wrote on his evaluation form that for the first 6 months, it was the hardest part of his life, taking instructions from women. Because all his life he's been taught they have nothing to offer the world. They were good for the home, they were good for childbearing and rearing, but men, there was nothing intellectual they had to offer any man. But at the end of it, he said one thing. These months have helped me to see my wife in a different light. It has enhanced our relationship and our friendship, and it has done her a lot of good. I don't know what your socialization must have been. I don't know what your life experience may be, but the one thing that I know is that for us to see sustainable peace, for us to see global peace, we must embrace the world without those marks. Bishop Dennis Sangolani says it in a very good way. For us to see global peace, for us to embrace sustainable peace, we must embrace a world that celebrates victory without losers. Thank you.
And we have a group of people who are interested in your work and interested in your story and interested in your insights. So we are happy to open up the floor to questions for Ms. Gbowee. Yes. So are there microphones? So can someone help? Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Batabi Libntombeni. I am an adjunct professor at John Jay College. I teach a class called The Sociology of Conflict. And in that class, I show the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And I have some of my students here with me tonight, and we are so terribly excited to meet you and to have this opportunity to hear from you firsthand. In the film, you talk briefly, and your colleagues as well, about what happened with the former child soldiers and former combatants and perpetrators. A unit on restorative justice and on forgiveness. And I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about that, what happened afterward, and about integrating and reaching out after violence.
Well, one of the things that, one thing that I've learned, and we learned it the hard way at the World Bank years ago. We went to the World Bank to advocate for a whole bucket list that we had brought from Liberia. And amongst those things, we had the rehabilitation of child soldiers as crucial to community development and sustainable peace. I think we had like 20 items that we're looking for funding for. And after beautiful presentations, they picked that paper and there was just one response. We'll meet you all tomorrow. Go back and prioritize your priorities. So we went back, and in prioritizing our priorities, let's be realistic. You have women in the room who had been affected by war. If you were to choose tackling rape and rehabilitating child soldiers, who would you choose? So by the time we got through prioritizing, they were at the bottom of the list. And I'm giving you that example just to show you that in a real rehabilitation, reconstruction, reintegration scenario, not just in Liberia, but in countries that have gone through conflict, that's how ex-child soldiers and combatants drop to the bottom of the list. Because people are now more concerned about those who were actual victims. And it's difficult for people, unless you really work with these young people, and it's difficult for you to justify that these boys and girls are also victims. How do you make of a 9-year-old who got left back, was fed drugs for several months, given a gun, and he went to war, now is amputated, he's 20-something, and his only life is begging on the street and taking drugs, but he's having children. And he's passing this narrative on to these children that are fought for those good-looking people. And they never repay me in any way. 20 years down the line, our children, my children, even though I'm a peace activist, will fit the profile of those people. And the children of these combatants could now create a whole new scenario. It is a difficult thing. And if I may come back to Liberia, that was one part of the rehabilitation process that failed. We still have these young boys, and the only way they can make it is to be either beg on the street or do something. Earlier on in my social work career, I worked with them. And one of my biggest frustrations that kind of really helped push me away from social work was sitting with these boys, designing counseling programs and skills. And then after they've gone through months of counseling, they come with a whole re-entry plan to you and say, this is what I want to do. In those years, one of my biggest frustrations of one of the boys that I worked with who wanted to go back to his village. And because he had learned skills in shoemaking and other things, wanted to go back to do work with young people there. He felt like it was his way of giving back. We tried to raise $600 in 1998 to get him back into his village. No organization could give us 600 cents. In a few months, he was back to doing drugs. Till today, he's on the streets. So it's really a complex thing. If you go to countries that have gone through war, you find that these group of people are ready-made mercenaries. And for our region in West Africa, they just extend our conflicts, you know. So Sierra Leone ended, they moved to Liberia. Liberia ended, they all migrated to Cote d'Ivoire. And they're just sitting and waiting. If something pops up somewhere else, they're on their way there because this is the only trade they know, and no one has the sense to decide we will allot this amount of money to this group of people. I was in Libya recently, and one of the biggest things I saw was after the drones, there's no money for anything.
Yes, go ahead. Could you, is there a mic? Thanks.
What advice would you give to the women of political violence in Syria?
That's a tough one. And right now, Hafiza and I are trying to figure our lives out because I've been invited to go and work with the women of Syria. You know, most times the way I engage with communities and women who have gone through conflict is not to go with a know-it-all attitude. Sometimes all these women need is just the space to think through and just the presence of someone who's been there and done that. Sometimes they really do not want to hear anything. But when it comes to women in conflict contexts, whether Syria, whether Libya, whether Congo DRC, my one learning from Liberia is that unless that group embrace a common identity, coming together to work for peace will be the most difficult. I was in Congo from Kinshasa to Bukavu, every other place. And the women knew exactly what they needed to do. But at the end of the trip, what I said to them was that until you can get to the place where political affiliation, ethnic group victory, all of these things doesn't matter, it will be difficult for you to forge. And it is only in coming together with a unified voice that you can help to stop a situation. Let me give you an example. A few years back in Uganda, they decided to pass a bill on polygamy. The women movement, and they have a very strong women movement with Maria Matembe and the rest of them, very powerful women, decided they were going to protest. What they did not imagine, or what they failed to do, was to seek, instead of just going like that, try to seek the opinions of different women's groups and say, how can we forge this? They got to the Parliament House the next morning. Whilst they were here saying no to polygamy, women were there saying, we need polygamy. Some of them went back home and said they had headache. But for the women of Syria, I think what is important is first talking. And no NGO wants to spend money on creating the space for women to just exhale. Let me tell you, when we go through conflict, if you've been in a situation of war, or even in a situation of hardship, you will rarely hear the mother complain or talk about her experiences. In my work in Liberia, women went to look for food, they got raped, they came home with whatever food, fed their families, and never said a word. When death happens, everyone cry on them. All of the negativity and the illustration I give it is like you have dirt on a table and you take a sponge and put it in. It absorbs and absorbs and absorbs. For anyone to start peace building or the process of building peace, they must be able to squeeze out that dirt. And in most of our conflicts, women do not have the space to exhale or to squeeze out the dirt. So if going to Syria, the first thing I would say to my sisters, let's make a circle, let's talk about our experiences. That you cannot give power if you do not have it to give. You cannot give strength if you do not have it to give. And you cannot give peace if there's no peace internally.
Yes, go ahead. I could bring it up.
Hi, my question is on land grabbing and sustainable development in Liberia. So we've been reading how the government has been selling a lot of land to foreign companies and how that's undermining sustainable peace and undermining basic food security and causing poverty. So what's going on in Liberia to try and address this issue of land grabbing and...
Well, there are two scenarios happening in Liberia today when it comes to land issue. Is one, in communities where you buy a piece of land and if you don't build as fast as you can, they will resell to someone else. And so even if you have a deed or a paper that puts you as the owner from 20 years ago, you will have a case that you cannot. And when I was heading the Liberian Reconciliation Initiative, one of the first things I did, contrary to popular opinion that I did nothing, I had to say that, was to take a trip to 3 counties, Bon, Grand-Jide, and Nimba. And the idea was to go to these communities and sit with people and first ask about what reconciliation was to them. And then what were their priorities for reconciliation. Those were the simple questions. And one of the things that was cross-cutting in all of those communities was the land issue. It was a key issue for contention from Grand-Jide to Nimba to Bon. Every other primary priority for reconciliation was completely different. So for example, in Grand-Jide, their priority for reconciliation was the relationship with the people of Nimba County. In Nimba County, their priority for reconciliation was the issue of land. And in Bon County, the priority for reconciliation was the tension amongst the leaders within that place. But the one common thread was land in every area. We did a full-page report, included not our recommendation, but the recommendation of the people and we submitted that report to the president of Liberia. I've refused to make that report public to anyone because at the time, I felt like until we go into different things which we were trying to do, she would be the one to look into those reports and say, this is what needs to be done. On the other issue of the multinational companies coming, one of the things that I see will happen in that country is that after this regime, those companies will be in a big mess depending on who takes over, because they will have to renegotiate some of the deals. For example, the Mo Stevens report, which is an audit that the government asked a firm from London to do, cites 68 concessions agreements that was passed by the government, and only 2 of those went through the proper channel. So 66 were bribed into action. So eventually, people will come. The one thing that I know is that we're so exhausted from 14 years of fighting ourselves. You know how you have this baby that will just decide I will cry. And that child will cry, eventually cry itself to sleep. Is what the Liberians have done. We've killed ourselves and fought ourselves for so long that we do not even have the energy to fight anymore. So, no, I don't see us going to war. There will be clashes here, there, and yonder, but eventually people will come to the place where they will be asking these groups to renegotiate. But the land issue in Liberia is a very, very fragile issue, and it's something that communities, governments, and everyone need to forge partnership to be able to work on. I don't know if I've answered your question, but basically that's what I can give you.
Go ahead, if we can run it back there and go ahead all the way back. Good.
Hello. Thank you. I'm from Colombia, and we are in this sensitive peace process going on in Cuba. And there has been a lot of debate in the country because none of the negotiators that went to Cuba are women. And there's a lot of women organizations that have been trying to claim a space for that. Some days we feel that the process is crumbling. Some days we feel that the process is going good and we feel hope. And some days we think that there are some women that could be dealing with these situations in a better way. Do you think that in a situation of negotiation and peace process, the role of a woman would give us what we've been waiting for 60 years?
You know, coming from having observed the Liberian peace talks, one of my, I'm looking for the word. I'm so afraid to be in the space of any peace talks because not only will it give me flashbacks, it's one of the things that annoys me the most. When people make this lame argument that, one, we do not find the qualified women, or two, is the men that made the war, and they are the ones qualified to bring peace. On the issue of qualification, those of us who were in Accra for the Liberian peace talk saw the caliber of people that were around the table. Dumb. And most often, the warlords are very dumb people. That's one. Let me give an example. What's the name of the guy with the M23 22 group in Congo, the rebel group.
Coney.
No, not Coney. Coney is from Uganda. The one from Congo with the group in the rebel leader in Congo. He gave an interview to an African magazine. And I read the interview, and the only thing I could say, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Because as he was being interviewed, because when there is peace talks now, he is one of the major broker of peace on behalf of the Congolese people. And he's saying that the president of Congo, DRC, Kabila, what's his name? Joseph. It's very difficult. He's a stubborn young man. This is part of the interview. And he's very stubborn and he thinks he knows it all. But you know what? He's my friend. I have his telephone number. Watch, I'm going to call him right now. And he makes this call. And they keep a conversation. Then he turns it off. See what I told you? He's my friend. I have his number. So in between the line of the interview, I'm asking myself, what is the relevance of this telephone number to this conversation about peace in Congo? The people know nothing. And there is this guy, Jeffrey Jitterman, who wrote an article a while back on civil wars in Africa, and he calls it On Wars. They are no longer wars, and the liberation movement, not just in Africa, if I may say, but in other parts of the world, lacks leadership. Because in the years past, when people were trying to liberate their people, they had a plan. Today, they have nothing. It was based on some ideology. People wonder, why can't we get rid of Mugabe? Mugabe had a plan. He came from a true revolutionary movement. I don't support him in any way. But there was something up here. Half of the people now making wars have nothing. But unfortunately, the way our global politics and peace building is done is that these are the people who have to sit around the table and negotiate the lives of people, including women. But if you put some of those women around the table and to answer your question, it will happen because one, what we know of peace talk is that the more it drags on, the more DSA these people take back home. So it's about the money. How much money we're able to bank. So one day one person is in, the next day another person cannot come. So that is one day of sitting and just drinking champagne and messing about with any kind of girl they can find. And then they come back and talk for 2 days, then they break up again. But if you had women around the table, they will consider the needs of the people. I'm not saying, and most times you get people ask me this question, they try to trap me. Do you think women are better leaders? Do you think women are better negotiators? The answer is they're more thoughtful. And thoughtfulness is something that is lacking in the way peace is done globally. In 2003, the disarmament broke down in Liberia. So we had gone that morning to talk to the generals. And these were people who before fought for Taylor. When you heard their name, you would be so afraid because of the stories that people told about them. But their fighters had gone on a rampage. So they were all in hiding. We sought them, we tried to find them. This woman, this high, knew where to find all of them. And she knew their cell phone numbers. So we called this person, they were like, yeah, we can meet. Yeah, we can meet. Yeah, we can meet. And in less than an hour, we had 5 of the most notorious generals with us. We're on our way to the UN. In like a split second, the fighters knew where we were standing. They were across the street, sporadic shooting. And I was like flat on the ground. Lord, we're going to die today. Eventually, the head of the UN came out and invited the generals. As soon as we tried to follow, they closed the gate and said the women stay out. What they did not know was that the boys across the street had told them, if you go in there and negotiate without those women, because we know they will protect our interests, you come out, you're dead meat. So midway in, they all stood and told the UN officials, the women have to come. So they opened the gate and we came in. And they said, this is the UN's position. What is your position? And they will turn and look at us. We'll scribble their position on the paper, pass it to them, and they will read. This is our position. What is your position? We had to write and pass it to them. By the time we came out of that meeting, they were safe, the boys were happy, and the shooting has stopped. But this is just to show you that we did not go into that room to see how much of the $300 that they were giving to 10,000 fighters that we could get. So we went in there thinking about the needs of the people, thinking about the needs of the fighters who were upset, and not those five men who were the power brokers. So most times when people say, women, do you think they're better? Yes, there are some women who have their own issues. We're not saying, but when it comes to issues of leadership and the greater good of people, they are more thoughtful leaders. And to answer your question, I think that's the way to go. But unfortunately, until the women of Colombia can push and keep pushing and keep going to everyone and saying, this is where they just need to camp out. Find money and go and camp out. But sometimes, like I said one day to the women at State Department, we become angry too politely. And there is no polite anger anymore. The world that we live in is a world where if you must be heard, you have to put your foot down. And those women in Colombia need to do that. Until they can do it, that peace talk will continue. And when the peace agreement is signed, there will be one line, and it will not say women, it will say gender balance.
Well, I think we're... I know this has been a long day for you. I know it's been a long year, decade, probably more for you, but we want to thank you so much for coming and sharing with us, your insights, your stories, your extraordinary sense of what can be, what should be. You're a moral leader to all of us, so thank you so much for being here, Layman.